I'm Pete Stehman. I'm an author from Collinsville, Illinois, and here to talk with you today about the Robert Prager lynching, which occurred April 5, 1918. It's somewhat a black mark on the community for what occurred back then. It was the only lynching of a German immigrant during World War I, which occurred in the United States, and it brought the city certainly some unwanted attention at that time, and since that time, the city, for a long period of time, just kind of ignored the event, and obviously it was nothing to be necessarily proud of, but it is an important part of our history that we want to remember. Just I think so that it can't happen again. And who would think the story of this persecution would be so relevant 100+ years later, but the story is sadly still relevant in the United States. So the basic story is that Collinsville, like much of Madison County and St. Clair County, was heavily dominated by coal miners and the coal mining industry in 1918. It's a high water production time for the mines in the Collinsville area. Robert Prager, a somewhat transient German immigrant, comes to town, and basically he had been a baker, working for a local baker by the name of Lorenzo Bruno, and he hears of the high salary that miners are getting in early 1918, and decides that he would try his hand at mining. So he goes there and begins a laborer's job at the mine, and is trying to get on at a regular mining position. Those were the positions that were making a very good amount of money at the time. Basically, he gets into a dispute with the union leadership. This is perhaps due to Prager's somewhat argumentative personality. But certainly he held some views. He held some somewhat socialist views. That said, he was very patriotic, hyper-patriotic. We know from the time that President Wilson declared war in 1917, and Prager was living in St. Louis. He was very patriotic, and no one seems to question that except the miners after this incident happened. In any case, he is rejected for membership in the union, which is effectively going to deny him a job in the mining industry. He takes umbrage at that and lashes out by means of some written notes or posted notes, typed notices, in the area of the Maryville mine, of the Donks No. 2 mine in Maryville. He posts these at nearby taverns and places about the mine. And when the miners get off work on the night of April 4, 1918, they're irate and go up to his home in Collinsville, seek him out, and drag him out. And the intention is to use him in a patriotic parade. They had done this previously after the union meeting when they rejected his membership request, but they did it again tonight in Collinsville, and they removed him from his home, took the shoes from his feet, and wrapped him in the flag, and made him walk up and down Main Street while they paraded him around the many bars which were on Main Street at that time. And again, this is Loon era, men only in the bars, and the bars were filled with primarily coal miners. They marched him up Main Street, or check that, they marched him west on Main Street, and the mayor, seeing all this transpire, Mayor Siegel called the police department and requested them to remove the man from the midst of the mob. The mob was about 300 people at that point, again parading him up and down in front of the bars on Main Street, saloons on Main Street. He is taken to the city hall, and which also was the location for the police department, and he is there. The men are agitated that their fun had been taken away, essentially, that their entertainment had been taken away for the evening. They ask for him to be released, and the mayor says, no, we're going to hold on to him for federal authorities. The crowd disperses then, but reassembles about an hour later, reassembles after the bars had been closed on Main Street. Again, the mayor's intention here was for the men to go home, but what it had was the effect of putting hundreds of drunken men out onto Main Street. And out in the middle of the street there, they argued what they should do. And basically a man came forward with a flag again, and all the miners said, we'll follow the flag. And they marched back up to City Hall and demanded that Prager be released. At this point, the mayor, there was some confusion between the police officers in the building and the mayor, but the mayor was given a message where he believed that Prager had been turned over to federal authorities or taken perhaps to East St. Louis or to Belleville to another jail. This was not the case. The mayor effectively allowed them to search City Hall, and on their second search, the miners found Prager hidden in the basement of City Hall. From that point, they marched him back out to Main Street and west on Main Street, and then turning onto the St. Louis Road to the top of Bluff Hill. This whole time he's being harassed. He's being beaten. He's being at one point during the parade earlier, we know thumbtacks were thrown out in front of him, and as he walked with his bare feet, and he was made to walk over the thumbtacks. At various times, he was threatened with being thrown down before a streetcar. And he was humiliated, made to sing patriotic songs and state patriotic phrases for the benefit of the crowd, which he complied with all those requests. The intent of marching him out of town, we believe, was just to tar and feather him. And the police took no action really to stop this. They kind of lingered behind the crowd. Their main intent was seeing that if he was going to be tar and feathered, that it would not occur within the city limits, as the mayor had told them to watch out for the man. But I think there was a general understanding that they were going to harass him, perhaps tar and feather him, but that would be it. They got to the top of Bluff Hill. Again, this is well out of city limits, Collinsville city limits at the time. Got to the top of Bluff Hill, and they tried to find the materials to tar and feather him, and they could not find any tar. And at this point, the mob, which is at this point is maybe 200 people, wondered what to do with him. They, again, not finding tar, they did find in the back of one of the vehicles there, a tow vehicle that was there, they found a length of rope. And a man went over and said, I know what we'll do with him. We'll hang him tonight. The crowd had started to thin now, and it got down to about 100 people who were there at the end, but they eventually did on the second try, after they, first time failing to tie his hands behind his back, they lynched him. And a crowd of maybe 100 people were there watching. Perhaps as many as 24, perhaps as few as a dozen men had their hands on the rope. And we know even that some young boys who were with the mob, who walked along with the mob, just for the fun of it all, they had their hands on the rope too. And basically, the case was investigated primarily by the early efforts of Coroner Roy Lowe, who was actually to die later in 1918 in the influenza epidemic. But he investigated along with state authorities. The local sheriff at that time, the Madison County Sheriff, was Jenkins, who was highly sympathetic with coal miners, himself being a former coal miner. The case was investigated, brought to trial. 11 men were brought to trial, and they were acquitted after a relatively brief trial, about 3 days, in the Madison County Courthouse. Certainly the first major trial that had occurred in the courthouse after it was constructed, I believe, in 1916, or completed construction in 1916. But it was a remarkable case that kind of shamed this community, but effectively, you know, it was a culmination of many other factors. It's easy to say that that Prager got crossways in this stream of blind patriotism, which came across the country in World War I. But we know now there are many more factors involved in it, and it kind of help explain why it happened in Collinsville and nowhere else in the nation in 1918. So at this point, I think I'd like to talk about those what I call the 5 takeaways from the Prager lynching. Bring out my glasses for this, but first off, I think we have to point out the popular storyline is that this occurred because of super patriotism in the nation. But we need to say, and everybody needs to understand, that the war, at least initially, was highly unpopular with a huge segment of the population in this country. Woodrow Wilson, who had been reelected 6 months earlier, using the campaign slogan of "He kept us out of war." At this point, the U.S. had about 33% of its residents were immigrants or had at least one parent who was an immigrant. There was a general feeling among socialists, such as Senator Robert La Follette and others, that this is a rich man's war and is fought with poor man's blood. There's some other indications, too, that the war wasn't that popular in Collinsville. They were seeking of the drafted men. All the men had been registered in June of 1917, or they started registering men in June 5 of 1917. And they shipped men out several months later, the first batch of drafted men from the community. And of that group, they asked, who's ready to go early? We've got our first batch of 11 we need to turn over and send out. Who's ready to go early? And basically, they didn't come up with filling that group of 11 men until they got down to about the 265th number drawn. So it wasn't like people were lining up at the door, ready to get out of the community and still go fight this fight. Certainly, they left it as an option. I know some men had family responsibilities to take care of, or business responsibilities. But it was funny for everybody talking so patriotically about wanting to defeat the Hun and defeat the Germans and to remove the Kaiser from office, that we had to get down to 265th name drawn to fill that allotment, that first allotment of 11 people. Also, point out in Collinsville, in the first 2 bond sale drives, war bond sale drives, the city failed to meet its quota. After the third war bond drive, which incidentally started 2 days after Prager was lynched, the city nearly doubles its expected quota. Again, that was 2 days after the lynching, and it obviously had a big impact on people's donations, because many people were challenged on the streets, and it was thought that a way to express show your patriotism was that you had purchased war bonds. We'd say after the fourth war bond drive, again, some months after the lynching, it again struggled to meet its quota, and the newspaper actually threatened to publish the names of people which had donated, and obviously unspoken there would be the people who had not donated. It would essentially make them potential victims for criticism and or attack. And by the time the war was over, the victory bond drive only met its quota when the banks bought nearly 50% of the bond quota. So again, despite the storyline of super patriotism, the war, at least initially, at least until our troops got over there, was not a popular concept in this community, as it was not in much of the nation, which is primarily an isolationist nation in 1918. Everyone had a strong need in 1918, however, to show their patriotism, just to be above suspicion or risk being called pro-German. And this wasn't just people of German lineage, but people all throughout the community. But for 25 cents, you could join the Red Cross, and it was seen as a patriotic move if you did that. Again, we talked about the war bond purchases earlier. Men were challenged on the streets 2 days after the lynching that had they bought their war bonds. This was an intent, again, for people to say that they were patriotic, that they were patriotic U.S. citizens. They were also asked if they'd signed membership cards to join the State Council of Defense, which the Collinsville Committee of the State Council of Defense had organized several weeks prior to that. And they were asked if they had signed the cards to join that. It effectively was somewhat of a loyalty pledge, but in the scenario following this lynching, it became a tool of intimidation too. These pledge cards were put down in front of the people or the pledge to join and to back the war effort in the State Council of Defense was an effort to sign up patriotic citizens, true, but in this case, in Collinsville, 2 days after the lynching, 1 and 2 days after the lynching, it was used kind of as a form of you're going to keep quiet about what you know or what you've heard of this lynching. And corresponding to that, on Saturday, a day and a half or so after the lynching, a man silently walked up and down Main Street saying nothing but carrying the flag. And again, the flag was used in this scenario, as abhorrent as it is, the flag was used as a tool of intimidation this time. The people were to show the patriotism, people were to sign up for the State Council of Defense, and when they did that, they were also to keep their mouth shut. That was the intention of that. But it was so bad, and so the environment was tough enough in the days following the lynching that the governor had threatened twice to declare martial law on the community, once Friday morning, and later again Friday afternoon after he heard about the intimidation which was occurring on the streets of Collinsville. A third takeaway we'd like to talk about is that perhaps the greatest untold story of 20th century history is of the suppression of civil liberties that occurred during World War I. And like I say, it may be the greatest untold story in our nation's history. But the Germans at that time were the most highly respected immigrant group in the nation. But all of a sudden, the standing fell markedly. Whether you had German classes being, German language classes which were stopped being taught in schools, in public schools, or whether you had streets being renamed in St. Louis, all sorts of things to oppress Germans. And this was this ended up being a payback time, effectively, for a lot of the other immigrant groups who had heard Germans was put on a pedestal for decades and decades. All of a sudden, this was payback for the Russians, for the Irish, for the Italians, for the other. Those were the big immigrant groups represented in the Collinsville area, and of course the Anglo or the English. During this time, there are groups such as the American Protective League, the Sedition Slammers, the Terrible Threateners, and my favorite, the Anti-Yellow Dog League, which had 1,000 units, and it was open to boys over 10 years and older who were encouraged to listen in on adult conversation, and who were encouraged to listen for adult conversation and report it if that conversation was unpatriotic. And we assume this included reporting your parents or family members if they had said something unpatriotic also. What we do know is this suppression of civil liberties ramped up to a terrific amount of violence in the first quarter of 1918. And throughout the nation, there were patriotic parades. Men and women were tarred and feathered. They're beaten. They were ridden on a rail out of town. They were painted yellow, or their businesses or homes were painted yellow. Some local examples. In Staunton, a boy and his father were interviewed by the Secret Service because the boy had failed to state the Pledge of Allegiance as required that morning in school. Again, reported to the Secret Service. In McLean County, a woman was arrested because she, tired of the incessant begging for money for the Red Cross chapter. She said she'd given enough, and she didn't want to give any more, and she was tired of hearing about it. Well, she found herself charged in federal court for alleging she had violated federal statute. At this time, we talked about the bond drives earlier, but the persons who solicited funds for the bond drives, the third bond drive, they were given yellow cards that they could fill out with information about anyone who said anything negative about the bond drive. And again, appropriately colored yellow cards to show their cowardice. And the bond drive solicitors were encouraged to mail these to the federal government, where the federal government would keep a central database, if you will, of all the unpatriotic people in the nation. Now let's talk more locally about issues, and certainly you have to understand this area was a hotbed of coal mining in 1918, and in almost all these coal mining towns in southern Illinois, they were bullied. The towns were bullied by the miners. The miners, again, in Collinsville, made up more than 50% of the adult workforce and or the male workforce, and they dominated the town. There was a very intense, very hard-fought unionization strike at the St. Louis Smelting and Refining Works, which was in Collinsville, and it was that strike was a unionization strike, and it was rather almost a microcosm of the factors which had led up to the East St. Louis labor and race riots of 1917. Again, this is a unionization strike. The coal miners strongly took the case of the for unionization of that plant. They didn't. The coal miners did not want this plant in Collinsville to use imported workers, and essentially that was a euphemism for blacks. They did not want black workers being brought into the town, and they wanted those positions to be union positions. The harassment included harassment occurring by the local police, by the Madison County Sheriff at the time, Sheriff Jenkins. We talked about him earlier, and by the union men. And the harassment was so significant that workers coming from East St. Louis on the streetcars, they would come down Collinsville Road, or what we call Business 40 right now. They would come down Collinsville Road, but the streetcars would stop at the bottom of Bluff Hill in Collinsville. And at that stop, the men who worked at St. Louis Smelting and Refining, which was on the north end of the community, they would get off the streetcar and be ferried the rest of the way to work in cars, because when they rode the streetcars in Collinsville, they were harassed and beaten, and it was very hazardous for them to make that last leg of the trip to St. Louis Smelting and Refining. So talk about all these factors going on. It's time to talk about lynching a little bit too. And by its nature, lynching is a very public crime, and it's intended to send a threat to others. In this case, the threat is be patriotic, or this is what happens to you. And it's also very difficult to prosecute. You'd never know if a member of the mob might have been one of the persons that requested to sit on the jury. You never know who exactly had their hand in doing what in the community. And with that in mind, no jurors were allowed to be selected from the Collinsville area, but we know there are still a high number of people rejected for juror service. 700 people were rejected for jury service before they found, as best they could, an unbiased jury. So some other thing I think we have to mention here is that the saloon era drinking fueled this incident to a very great extent. And saloon era drinking was very different than what emerged after Prohibition, where women were allowed in the bars at that time. But saloon era drinking was very, think back to Jack London time. Think back of no stools at the bar, a few tables and chairs for card playing and so forth, but primarily men standing on their feet, and spittoons and sawdust on the ground. Again, women not welcome in the bars. And in this town, one of the businessmen was asked about this time how miners spent their money. And he estimated that about, one of the veteran businessmen said, well, he thought about a third of the money was spent at St. Louis stores and mail order houses. About a third of the money was spent at Collinsville stores or shops. And about a third of the money went to the saloons. So if you can believe that, and every reason to believe that, if you can believe that concept, then it's very easy to understand how the miners were inebriated on a regular basis. So the typical cycle may have been, even for a married miner with a family in town here, for him to go home, work till 5 o'clock or so, to go home, to clean up again, change his clothes, go up, and be at the saloons for hours that evening, and then returning home, going to bed, and repeating the cycle the next day at the coal mine. Again, working 6 days a week. But we had many miners in Collinsville who were transients. They were immigrants. They didn't have any connection with Collinsville. They had there's no stability and no roots here, no familial roots, no strong infrastructure of friends. Because of this, they were more prone to be involved in activity which is really damaging to the community and damaging to them too personally. The mob at this point, again fueled by mostly drunken men, their intention that night was to go out, was to harass Prager and to have a little fun with him that night. And that fun had been halted. And again, this turned on a dime at the lynching scene. When they could not find tar, they were able to find rope, and that laid the groundwork for his lynching. Perhaps the biggest crime against the community at this point were that no one came forward to say no. When he was being paraded around patriotically, there's a general feeling that, yeah, they shouldn't do that, but no one stepped in to say no. Whether it was the police or other officials, no one stepped up. And I should backtrack a little bit there. I say there were efforts by governmental leaders to get the mob to cease and desist. And again, there was resistance by the mayor and other aldermen on the steps of City Hall. But again, when he was taken from the City Hall, the belief was they're going to harass him, they may tar and feather him. That'll be the end of it. And of course, it turned out much worse than that. Some other interesting things I think like to call to your attention here. The state's attorney at the time was Joseph Stoiber. The uninitiated may call him Joseph Struber, but it's actually the German pronunciation was Stoiber, although we don't know that he was using the Germanic pronunciation that much during World War I. But he lived in Highland. He would later close out his life as an attorney in Alton, I believe. But he was beaten in a fist fight by Sheriff Jenkins the day before the trial was set to start. The actual trial was set to start, and one can only assume it was an effort to incapacitate him prior to going into the trial. The trial was also prosecuted by an assistant state attorney general. Again, in Springfield, they were keeping close eyes on on the incident in Collinsville. We mentioned earlier that over 700 people were selected, men only at the time, Veniramen, to create this jury pool. And it took over 700 people before they finally found 12 men to sit and say they could somewhat impartially hear the evidence and render a verdict. So researching the book was, again, it was my first book, and I learned a lot about World War I, and which I knew I had to. It was, I knew I wanted to write something, a book that was where the research was strong enough that it would be published in academic press, and so some very interesting things that I learned about World War I that I kind of share with you now. We'll talk about Great Britain's efforts to bring the U.S. into the war, and the better told story, the more frequently told story, are of again Winston Churchill's efforts to bring FDR into supporting Great Britain during World War II, and obviously what was occurring in World War II was much more significant on a much grander scale even than what was occurring in World War I. But there are some things that Great Britain had done which fed the propaganda machine locally, and or in the U.S. rather, and were certainly somewhat underhanded. But among the things that it had done is the U.S. had a direct telegraph cable, which allowed easy communication between Berlin, Germany, and Washington in the U.S. And Great Britain severed this telegraph line. There's never any explanation of why they had done it, but they had done everything they could to take away any direct path of communication between Germany and the United States. In 1915, Viscount James Bryce did the Bryce Committee report on the war crimes and atrocities that the Germans and the other Central Powers were committing across Europe. And this report, which is basically later found to be, for the most part, rubbish, had wild exaggerations for propaganda purposes, both in the UK, but also to bring the U.S. into the fold on this war effort. They alleged numerous rapes and murders. One of the more terrific stories they had told was that a boy in a certain region of Belgium or France had both of his hands cut off by the dastardly German soldiers. So a group of men who were opposed to the war effort, included Clarence Darrow and a committee of others, went to Belgium, went to France to try to validate these stories, to see if they were true. And in the area where this boy was alleged to have had his hands cut off by the Germans, they offered a $1,000 reward if anybody had any information or could identify this boy. And again, $1,000 in 1915 is huge money. No one could provide one bit of evidence that this had ever occurred, but it was just an example of some of the wild exaggerations that the British did on the propaganda front to try to bring the U.S. into the war effort. And that said, U.S. involvement in World War I was inevitable after the Zimmerman telegram was sent, which essentially from Germany saying to Mexico that they would partner and become allies with the Mexicans if the Mexicans would support or become involved in this war effort against the U.S. So the Lusitania sinking aside, the torpedo warfare which was occurring in the Atlantic, all that aside, it became inevitable the U.S. was going to get involved in World War I after the Zimmerman telegram was sent and discovered in early 1918. Excuse me, in early 1917. Also, let's talk about the nation, if you will, filled in the early part of the century with immigrants who had come over, and again, America was their promised land. They were so pleased to be here, and many of them communicated back home and had other relatives come over and join them over here. But they had fled Europe for just the type of factors that it led up to World War I, and they wanted no part in fighting it. So again, an isolationist nation in the early part of the century, and it turns into a nation that goes full in for supporting the war effort. That said, the U.S. was only actively involved in battle for a limited number of months there. We had 120,000 initial deaths reported. Most of those were due to influenza or pneumonia. Again, U.S. involvement in the actual fighting was limited, and right near the final months, the 3 to 4 months, was pretty strong. There again, 120,000 initial deaths reported from World War I, but Thomas Fleming reports that the Veterans Bureau reported those fatalities may have been as high as 460,000 in 1930. This is again due to those who suffered chemical injuries from the chemical warfare or continued to deal with effects from artillery wounds or bullet wounds in an era when they didn't have that much ability to deal with in a very sophisticated manner with these wounds. In the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, there was an investigation by the Nye Committee on investigate banks and munitions interest of the profits they had made during World War I, and those were found to be just very high. It basically reinforced the point that had been made earlier that this is a money man's war to be fought with a poor man's blood. And again, the Nye Committee reported basically a situation that this war was not fought for the working man. All this creates an environment that leads us to become an isolationist nation again in the 1930s. And as late as May of 1940, only 7% of Americans in May of 1940 wanted U.S. to intervene militarily in Europe. This is at the time when Hitler was already in France. So I think you have to understand how isolationist we were at that time, and obviously we don't join in the war effort until after Pearl Harbor. I want to share one other thing with you, and this is a poster. It was printed as a poster, but also run as a newspaper ad. It ran in the Collinsville Herald the week after the lynching. And also this copy of it actually happened to run in a St. Louis newspaper, but this was sponsored by Anheuser-Busch and these businessmen here. Well, so guess who is happy out of this? Well, the government is happy for the patriotism that this would foment, but also the newspapers are happy because of all these advertisers basically paid for this ad space. I'd like to share a few paragraphs with you, rather, about what they have to say about slackers at the time. And the intent of this ad is to get people to buy war bonds. So this is for that third war bond drive, which occurred, kicked off right after the time Prager was lynched. Any man or woman in this town, and I don't care whether that man or woman is rich or poor, who does not take all the liberty bonds that he or she possibly can is in exactly the same class with those wretched creatures of feeble brain and feeble spine, those cowards we call slackers. Such a man or woman isn't worthy to blacken the shoes of an American soldier who goes across to give his life on the blood-soaked soil of France. Such men and women, no matter where they live, in cottages or mansions, are not fit to associate with real Americans. Such men and women are not fit to live in the community or any place in America. They are not fit to live at all. So that's, if you want to understand what the public displays of patriotism had to be during World War I, this is a pretty good graphic example of that. So I did want to share that with you. There's one other thing I'd like to share, and that's to talk about the community's embrace or lack of embrace of this tragedy. And for many years, there was no documentation on it. The story was not retold, was not very accessible to people. Certainly no landmarks or indications anywhere in town of where this had occurred. And I think that was largely due to the embarrassment of the people involved, the people who were watched the mob, the people who were in the mob. Many people, hundreds of people in this community, and were probably in a position later where they said, "Boy, I wish I'd done something to stop that," and no one had done that at the time. And there was certainly some regret over that. There was regret on the part of the police officials. There was regret, throughout the community that this had occurred. That necessarily, you didn't feel that regret in 1918 after the men were acquitted in the trial. Word got back to Collinsville. There was celebration in the bars and so forth. The men came back and were known to have been, celebrated quite a bit in the many saloons that dotted Main Street, Collinsville. And the attitude of that period was embraced by J.O. Monroe, who was the editor of the Collinsville Herald at that time. And there's no doubt that he, along with the publisher of the Collinsville Advertiser, felt great intimidation from the community of what to report and what not to report. The Advertiser did very little reporting on the trial at all. It just pretty much ended up saying next to nothing about the case, even though you had a case of national importance being tried in Edwardsville and being tried, and councilmen being tried. The Herald reported a significant amount on the Prager incident, and no doubt J.O. Monroe was feeling a lot of pressure in the community to not say so much. In any case, 1 week after the men were acquitted in 1918, Monroe wrote his column under the heading, "The Whole City is Glad." He went on to relate the opinion that many in the city held at the time. Outside of a few persons who may still harbor Germanic inclinations, the whole city is glad that the 11 men indicted for the hanging of Robert P. Prager were acquitted. The community is well convinced that he was disloyal. The city does not miss him. The lesson of his death has had a wholesome effect on the Germanists of Collinsville and the rest of the nation. In this day and time when human life is being sacrificed by the thousands for principle, Prager's death may be regarded as a cheap price to pay for the silencing of Germanic tongues. Monroe continued to publish the Collinsville Herald for many decades afterwards, and the paper was actually taken over by his sons after he left the newspaper publishing. But after raising 5 children and retirement from politics and publishing, Monroe in 1962 wrote the memoirs of his long career and reflected back on the Prager affair. 44 years later, with mature clarity only given an old man, he revisited the biggest story he had ever covered. Looking back on the whole horrible thing, it seems a nightmare. It began with gossip, fear, and hate for the alien. It grew with idleness, rabble-rousing talk, and excessive misguided patriotism, and the temper of drunkenness. It was made possible by the surprise and carelessness of the police and unfortunate misguesses on what to do with the man. When the crowd first got to the victim, no one really thought of hanging. Tar and feathers were intended. The tar was not found. A rope was. By now there were over 200 yelling men, flushed with beer, hot from marching over a mile, confused and muddled with mob psychology. Nowhere appeared a sober, clear-headed man to say no and make it stick. And so came violence, death, tragedy, and shame. Thank you for letting me speak to you this afternoon, and I would gladly take any questions. If anybody has any for me, you can contact me through the Collinsville Historical Museum or go to my email address of pstehman, Stehman, @gmail.com. Thank you.
Bye.